There's all sorts of data that we can download from the internet that's in the form of CSV files or Excel spreadsheets, and it's very easy to get this data into DataGraph. Today I'm going to show you how to do this using data that I downloaded from the World Bank on population, where I downloaded this Excel file that we'll talk about. And I'm going to use that information to create this graph that shows world population from 1960 to 2020, and each of these sections of the bar has the world population for a given region of the world. We're also going to create this graphic where we now are looking at specific regions of the world, and the information shown is by country. This is also linked to a global variable that allows us to very quickly look at different regions of the world and filters the data according to this global variable that we select. We'll start by importing our data from the Excel spreadsheet. To show you very quickly what's in this sheet, there's one tab with the data itself. This has the countries and years of population going from 1960 to 2014. There's some metadata where each country code is listed individually, and a final tab that has metadata for the overall spreadsheet. Since I'm going to be working really with the data, I can use a sliding bar to hide the graphing window, and I'm going to open up my column definition so I can see a list of my columns. I can delete the X and Y column that is in this file by default. And I want to show you that if I take the Excel file and I just drop it simply on the data table, every column that is in the file gets added now to my DataGraph file. And regardless of what tab it's located in, all these columns are just extracted together in one lump. For a file that's as complicated as this one, I really would not recommend that approach because DataGraph has a much better way to handle this. So I'm going to just Command Z to get rid of that. And instead, I'm going to drag my Excel file and drop it onto my definition list. And you'll see a group is now created that uses the name of the Excel file. And there are groups underneath that main heading that show you the data organized by the tabs that were in the Excel file. So we have a group for data and we have two groups for the metadata. Next, let me double click at the top of the screen to expand this. And if I open up any of these groups, you'll notice that there are not any column titles yet. I'm going to go ahead and first hide the data so we can focus on the metadata, where for both of the groups that have metadata, the first row of the data is actually what we want to use as our column title. So there's a shortcut to right click and say use row for column titles. So you can see how they've been added within the column definition list, and also above you'll see the column titles. So now I'm going to delete this first row, highlight it, hit the delete key, and I want to delete it from only the visible columns. Now let's look at the format of the data, and first I will hide the metadata. And you'll see in this case, row number 4 is the one I'd like to use for my column headings. So I'm going to right click, use row for column titles, and then I don't need this row anymore, so I can hit delete. I'm going to delete it from just what's visible. But there are also these other rows up above that also have some information that I may want to keep. In DataGraph, you can easily add in a comment block. So to add this up at the top of my column definition list, I'm going to highlight this first column and hit this shortcut to add a comment block. So now I have a place that I can put this information. I'm just going to copy and paste into my comment block. And when this was last updated, there we go. So now I can delete these 3 rows, and I've got my data in a pretty good format now. As we look at this a little bit closer, you can see how the indicator name and the indicator code are the same throughout this entire data set. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete those two columns. I can highlight them in the data table, in the column definition list, and delete them. And another thing that I want to do is I want to flatten this data. This is also considered denormalizing the data, such that I want every number that's shown here to actually be a row in my data table. And this is a lot more convenient for analyzing the data. This is really, really easy to do in DataGraph. I love this. So I can highlight my columns, and if you go Data, Flatten Columns, one of the things that happened when we flattened the data is that we went from about 250 rows to over 13,000 rows of data. And every value of population is now in an individual row. I can easily change my columns here to better represent what we have, population and year. Another thing that I also want to do is year is noted here as a text field. So the little icon that you see here represents a text data. However, we want this to actually be numerical. So I'm going to go ahead and use this context menu to convert this to a number. One of the things I really like about DataGraph is how we can link between different groups of data, similar to operating within a database, but I feel like it's very easy to do this here. And you see the results instantaneously. So for example, here I can add what's referred to as a map column, and I'm going to do that to allow me to map between my data table and my metadata, where let's just look at the metadata again just to see what this is. Here we have just a list of country codes, and then we, for example, have the region that that country code corresponds to. And in the data, we also have country code as well as country name. Let's go ahead and then add a map column. I'm going to add this using the drop-down menu, and I would then specify that I'm going to link the country code, and the method here is from columns, where I can specify the key in my metadata, also being country code, and then the value that I would like to display. So say, for example, the region. And now in my data table, I have both the country name and the region that that corresponds to. Now, personally, I really don't necessarily like to have these text labels, for example, here for country name, listed in both places within my data as well as in my metadata. You see here, the country name is actually called table name, but these correspond to one another. And to make this a little clearer, let me hide the income group and the notes. And what I want to show you is how I can also create another map here for country name, again using the country code. And there's a shortcut. I showed you how to do it for region by creating the column, but there's also a shortcut where if I have a key such as country code that's located in more than one group, I can click on the gear menu to get to this map shortcut, and DataGraph will automatically search your file to find other groups that also have the same column name and give you suggestions as to what you might want to link to. So here I'm going to create another map column for table name. So it sets up this this column automatically for me. This map column populates it for me correctly. And here I have now table name and country name. Let me just hide the region for now just to make this a little clearer. And what I like about this kind of setup is if I then decide to change the way I refer to a country. Here, for example, I have Bahamas, comma, the. Say I wanted to just call this Bahamas. Now in my data table where I have Bahamas linked back to my metadata, it's going to use this name here as I changed it, whereas the country name that's just listed as text obviously doesn't have that, and it's just repeated over and over again. So every time the Bahamas is listed, it's going to have my correct There it is. I have the name as I want to show it, given how I specified that in the metadata. So I'm going to go ahead, just to simplify my file here, I'm going to delete country name and just keep the region and the, again, table name, which it really is the country name, which is coming from my metadata. Notice now that for some of our rows here, the region field is empty. And if we go back to our metadata, you can see that, for example, here for Arab world, there is no region given. And the reason is that this is itself a region rather than an individual country. If we wanted to note that, we could go ahead and I'm going to hide the data table. And if I type in the fact that this itself is a region, then that would show up in the data table just everywhere where we have Arab world. To make it easy, instead of having to go through and type region into all of these blank spaces, I can actually go ahead and there's a shortcut here to right click. I'm going to select my empty rows. And now I can right click on the word region and down at the bottom, set rows to region. This allows me to fill in all these blanks with a text label. And again, I go back to my data table and you can see how now there's no empty rows where there is a group of countries where the population is given. Now, in fact, I prefer to not have a data table like this where you have both sums of data as well as individual data. So we have individual country level data, and then we have other data that's a summation of those countries. We can actually have DataGraph do those summations for us. And to do this, what I'd like to do is actually to remove everywhere where we have this regional data. And I can do this really easily. I'm going to hit Command F, and you'll see how I had actually typed this before, so it says displayed contains the word region. So we have all of these columns here now where the data are actually for these regions of countries. And I'm simply going to hit Control A. Now everything's selected, and hit the delete key. And it's asking me, where do you want to delete this data? I want to delete this in the group data, and it's showing me here all of the columns that are within this group. I do that. I say done. Next, we're going to go ahead and start visualizing our data, and I'm going to use the pivot command in order to do this. Pivoting allows us to calculate sums and other statistics on our data. And in particular here, I want to be able to sum population over given regions. And I'm going to set up the columns in the order that I want them displayed for my pivot. I also need to pull back my graph window. I'll delete this plot command. I don't need that. And notice how I've organized this according to year, region, and population. I want year in my pivoted data to remain a row. I want region to be what's pivoted into columns, and population is what I'm going to sum over. If I highlight these three columns and then hit the pivot command shortcut in the toolbar, a pivot command is created using those rows and columns, and then the value is set to population. So it's just a shortcut for creating the command with the rows that I want in the location that I want them. Now I'm going to customize this graph. For example, I want this to be an X stacked graph. You could also make this an area graph if you prefer. I'll go ahead and leave this as a stacked graph. And I'm going to need to go into the detail view of this drawing command in order to get more options in terms of what I specifically want to create for this graphic. You'll see here actually the data that's been pivoted, and one of the things that DataGraph is doing is it's lumping together these categories on the x-axis because there's so many of them. In fact, for this type of data, I really want the rows to be every value that's in the table. So I'm going to change this from automatic to unique values. Now all my years are shown, but I also need to unclick this categories button so that it realizes that these are numerical sources of data. I'm going to also change this slider, which defines the amount of width between bars, and change this so that there's no space between bars. I think this looks a little bit better. A recent addition into the pivot command is the ability to sort the data that's being pivoted, and that's controlled given this drop-down menu to the right-hand side. So if I want my columns in order of increasing values, then you can see here how I've been able to modify that. So the regions with the most population are shown at the top of my graphic. I can easily add a legend by adding a legend command. I'm going to place that on the right-hand side of my graph. I can add a title up above. And you may have noticed how, as I hover over each of these bars, you can see the exact number that makes up that portion of the bar and the region of the world that that corresponds to. This is because I have the hover command turned on. You can do that under, under the View drop-down menu. I can either hide the hover information, in which case I won't see it anymore, or go ahead and show hover information. I can also do Shift Command H in order to show what's in the hover. I'd also like to modify how my y-axis is displayed. Rather than showing these large numbers on the axis, I'm going to add an extra axis. So this is an additional command that's available under the command menu. Add extra axis, and here it is. So you'll notice how, well, first of all, it's showing on the x-axis. I want this to be on the y-axis. By default, it's putting it on the inside, just so you can see that it's there. I'm going to show it to the left, and if we just move this offset a little bit, you can see there's two axes actually displayed here. And what I'm changing are actually the units. I want to convert this. And here we have both what the data units are and the display units. So the ratio between data and display modifies what numbers are shown on the axis. So for example, if I make this 1,000, and let me go ahead and remove the old axis, not the x, but the y-axis numbers. As I continue to add more zeros here, then you'll see how my axis display has changed. And then I can add a label, and I'll go ahead and position this at the start of my data, add a little bit of an offset. So that was really easy to do. And again, I haven't had to do anything to modify my data or do any calculations. I'm just changing the way the axis is displayed. Now let's add an additional graphic where we're going to explore population for individual countries within regions. First, I'm going to actually clone the pivot command that I started with, because I've already some of the data I'm interested in are already set up in this pivot command. And I'm going to go ahead and change this, however, rather than say region, I want this to be my country. These are long lists because right now this is showing every country. I would like to go ahead and just show countries within certain regions, and to do that I'm going to use a mask. I like to set my masks up by using a group within my command menu. I'm going to go ahead and highlight my pivot command, click the group shortcut, and within this I can create a mask. So I'm going to mask my data on region, and so that you can see what's happening here, I'm going to go ahead and open my definitions also because we're going to need those now. And I want to be able to select what region I'm in. And there's a shortcut to create a variable, a global variable that allows us to select between regions. And to do that, I'm going to select text is and use this shortcut for create text menu. And notice how now I have this new global variable that just got created, and it has the list of all of the different regions that are in my data. And currently what's selected is the region for East Asia and Pacific. If I change this to North America, then you can see now how my data also changes corresponding to that region of the world. I'm going to go ahead and just change the name of this global variable to is region, just to be a little bit clearer as to what that is. And I can also use the value of this variable in my title of my new graph. Rather than calling this world population, I'm going to change this, clicking this menu to the right-hand side of the title bar, and here conveniently the global variables are listed, so I can just say is region, hit enter, and again now this shows North America. So when I change any of these, the selection for this global variable, then my data is changed corresponding to that selection. So I can really go through this data and perform an exploratory data analysis using these drop-down menus without having to create a graphic for every single region. Now, because there's so many countries in here, I may want to change how my graph is displayed in this case. I'll go ahead and make this a bit wider, and let's make my legend 2 columns. So now I can see all of these countries that are here. And again, there's so many countries that the colors are repeating, but because I have the hover on, you can go to any piece of data and see which country that corresponds to. What I've created here is really my own custom viewer for viewing this data and exploring this data, that I can go back and forth between these different regions and look to see how they compare between each other and what countries are included within these various regions, or go back and forth between these two graphs easily. I can also give titles to my thumbnails to make it easier to know what is in each of these graphs. And I can delete this empty thumbnail. We've covered a lot of ground in this video, from importing data to formatting data, pivoting data, and even an example using global variables. As always, if you have any questions, please contact us at help@visualdatatools.com, and we appreciate your input and your feedback.